So I'm very passionate about the Isle of Man Post Office and its significance to the island.
You've said previously about it as a social entity, or
Yeah,
words to that effect.
Absolutely. Well, I brought a motion in July of 2018, which talked about repurposing the Isle of Man Post Office for the 21st century, and that was well supported in Tynwald, and the post office were tasked with going back and coming up with a vision for the future.
Do you think the vision does that?
I don't think what's in front of us next week does that. No, I think it's very narrowly focused. They seem to be taking chunks and dealing with it. So they've dealt with the deliveries going down from 6 to 5, and the terms and conditions of the staff and the pension. They're now looking at the retail network, but they're looking at it very much through the lens of a financially responsible board, which of course that is something they need to be, but they're missing the bigger picture. And my motion back in 2018 was about Council of Ministers taking the lead on that vision. And the reason I did put it in the Council of Ministers was because I didn't feel that the Post Office Board would be able to go sufficiently across government to actually come up with the right vision, because I see the value of Isle of Man Post Office being of key social value.
Is this a case of the Post Office marking their own homework?
I don't know if I'd describe it as that. I think they've got a clear direction, and they're very much driven by the bottom line, as if they were a corporatised entity that had to deliver a profit for shareholders.
Should the post office be a profit-making venture?
They have parameters around them which require them to return a dividend to Treasury, and to operate within appropriate financial parameters. So from that point of view, yes, and of course any part of government has to be financially responsible, so I don't take any issue with that. I think the problem is they're just looking at that one dimension and missing the wider picture, and I'm really concerned that the motion that they've come forward with, effectively, if it gets approved by Tynwald, will effectively give them carte blanche to go and take apart the post office network on the island.
Who will be affected by this most? Because we've seen residents of St John's, probably an example recently, which I wouldn't consider necessarily to be an especially rural community, but they probably feel a bit underserved now. Do you think it's going to be rural constituencies who suffer next? Maybe
it will, and of course, my constituency and that of the Treasury Minister is rural, and it covers over a third of the landmass of the island, and it's not very densely populated. And we've got one of the things that the Post Office Board have highlighted is the number of post offices per head of population, and highlighted that the Isle of Man has far more than in other jurisdictions.
Does that take into account the sparsity of the population?
No, they're not even showing that level of sophistication. They're just showing that we have a lot more post offices per head, and ignoring the fact that the people are so far spread, and they're seeing the post office network as a cost to their business. Which, if they can take a big chunk of cost out of that, they believe that will help improve their financial performance. Now, then they're ignoring the impact of effectively cutting off the public-facing part of the post office, because to most people across the island, their local post office is the Isle of Man post office. Physically, they've not, as far as I can see, they've not engaged to any meaningful extent with the sub postmasters, and they very much see them as separate businesses. Now, the reality is, as the Economic Policy Review Committee report, which is also tabled on next week's Tynwald, shows, the two are different sides of the same coin. And I think Isle of Man Post Office Board are very much looking through their own financial lens, their own profitability, and they're making a decision which will fundamentally change the shape of postal services on the island going forward. And I think it's something that the public will not like. Now, I'm fully supportive of the need to adapt and evolve, and it's right that changes around us, the growth of the internet, and less use of cash in the economy, those things are real, and the post office do need to adapt to that. But I think they have to take people with them, and they cannot ignore the social value of the post office, particularly in the more rural communities, the more isolated communities, the more elderly communities, and I have some real concerns about the direction of travel.
Do you think your colleagues in Tynwald share those concerns?
I think there are many Tynwald members who do share those concerns. I think this is going to be quite an interesting one because I think the Council of Ministers will back the Post Office Board, which obviously gives quite a lot of votes in Keys. So I think it's going to be quite a challenge.
Does that make it a foregone conclusion?
Well, I don't think it's a foregone conclusion, but it's going to take a pretty united voice from
everyone else,
Tynwald.
basically.
Basically,
really?
yes, and of course, LegCo will be important in that slightly more independent perspective. But I think members need to hear the voice of the public, and if the public are concerned about this, then I think they need to. Now's the time really to speak, because I know that from what's happened previously, if this goes through, it'll be Tynwald approved it, therefore we've got carte blanche to do this. And I think the other thing with the report is the Ayre Post Office Board are effectively assuming the end of the payment of benefits through the post offices, and also vehicle licensing through the post offices. Now, it's quite clear to me that those decisions have not yet been made by government. They are things that may happen, but Ayre Post Office Board in that report are effectively assuming no income from those services. And I think what's going to happen is that they're going to portray such a poor picture of the future that effectively it'll become self-fulfilling, because sub-postmasters are independent agents. So if they can't see a viable future for their businesses, they're not going to continue, and then it'll be very much, well, the sub-postmasters have resigned, we're not going to re-advertise them, and the Post Office Board will be able to point the finger at everybody else, and we just need to be really mindful of that. At the end of the day, the post office is an integral part of the Isle of Man. I believe it's got value. It's a trusted brand. People relate to their connections, particularly in rural areas, with the post office. And I think we'd all be a lot poorer without the Isle of Man Post Office.